The evening sunlight filtered through the blinds of my home office, casting long, jagged shadows across the scattered blueprints on my desk. Architecture had always been my escape, my fortress of logic and creativity when life's chaos threatened to seep in. Lately, though, even these crisp, precise lines felt hollow, like the foundation of my life was starting to crack beneath me. Rachel, my wife of 7 years, had been distant for months now. At first, I chalked it up to stress. She was managing new responsibilities at work, long hours, and constant emails, but her absence, both physical and emotional, became harder to ignore. When she wasn't at the office, she was glued to her phone, her laughter tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Not warmth. Not humor. Something secretive. I should have asked her then. I should have confronted the unease gnawing at my gut. But I didn't. Maybe it was cowardice, or maybe it was the lingering belief that people don't just wake up one day and betray the life they've built. Either way, I stayed silent. Until that Friday evening. Rachel had left for one of her late meetings, her excuses as flimsy as tissue paper by now. I sat in the darkened living room, nursing a glass of scotch, when her laptop chimed from the kitchen counter. I wouldn't have touched it if it weren't for that sound. It was her email, open and glaringly obvious. A subject line caught my eye. Looking forward to tonight. XO Mark. Mark. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest as my brain waged war with itself. Don't open it, Ethan. It's not your place. But the other side of me, the side that couldn't ignore her lies anymore, won out. I clicked. The email thread spilled out before me like Pandora's box, each message another jagged piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Mark wasn't just her colleague. He wasn't even just a friend. He was an entrepreneur, a name I vaguely recognized from social circles. And he was, judging by the explicit nature of their exchanges, her lover. I sat there for what felt like hours, rereading the evidence. Her words were coy, playful, and unmistakably intimate. His replies dripped with confidence, as if he knew he had her completely. They spoke about restaurants, hotels, and secret afternoons stolen between meetings. My hands clenched the edge of the counter, the wood biting into my skin. This wasn't just infidelity. It was calculated. Premeditated. A betrayal so well orchestrated that I couldn't help but admire its audacity. And yet I didn't confront her that night. Or the next. Instead, I began my own quiet investigation. I needed to know who Mark was, and more importantly, what he meant to Rachel. Late at night, I combed through social media, LinkedIn profiles, and obscure business articles until I had built a complete picture. Mark was everything I wasn't: wealthy, flashy, dripping with charisma. He was the kind of man who bought champagne by the case and flew private jets to exotic destinations. He owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and judging by his lifestyle, business was thriving. It wasn't just about his wealth, though. Mark had something else, a kind of magnetic charm that made people gravitate toward him. Rachel must have been no exception. I wondered how it started. A harmless meeting? A flirtatious comment? Or was it always inevitable? The thought churned my stomach. By the end of the week, I had all the information I needed. And then some. The tipping point came when Rachel's phone, carelessly left on the nightstand, buzzed one morning. I glanced at it, half asleep, and saw his name again. Mark. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Whatever trust I'd been clinging to was officially gone. The architect in me, the meticulous planner, the strategist, came to life. I couldn't scream, couldn't fight. That would be too predictable, too weak. No, I needed precision. I needed control. I needed a plan. So that's exactly what I did. I started working obsessively in my home office, poring over blueprints late into the night. Rachel thought it was for a new project, something to distract me, maybe, from my growing coldness toward her. Little did she know, the apartment I was designing wasn't for a client. It was for her. And for Mark. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. It was going to be an unveiling. The days that followed were a balancing act. Every smile, every casual word exchange with Rachel felt like walking a tightrope above a pit of broken glass. She noticed, of course. She wasn't oblivious. "You've been so distant lately," she said one night over dinner, her fork pausing midair. "Is something wrong?" "Just a big project at work," I replied, the lie slipping off my tongue so easily it almost surprised me. "You'll see soon enough." That seemed to satisfy her. She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips, as if she were grateful I wasn't pressing her about her own increasingly erratic schedule. I wondered if she even felt guilty, or if she had justified it in her head as something I deserved. After all, wasn't that the story she must have told herself to sleep at night? That I was too focused on my career, too distant, too preoccupied with my blueprints to notice her unraveling loyalty? Her lies no longer stung. They only added fuel to the fire burning inside me, a fire I was carefully stoking into an inferno. While Rachel spent her evenings at work, or out with friends, I was meticulously constructing my masterpiece. The apartment wasn't just a space. It was a stage, a set designed for a performance they wouldn't forget. On the surface, it was perfection. A 2-story penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, an open-concept design, and furniture so luxurious it could make anyone feel like royalty. But the beauty was a mask, and behind it lurked the details only they would understand. I spent weeks sourcing everything I needed, abstract paintings splashed with red that, to the untrained eye, looked like art but to Mark and Rachel would evoke the inside jokes from their emails. Blurry, black and white photographs that hinted at the hotel lobby where their affair had begun. A sculpture, modern, striking, that resembled the necklace he'd gifted her in one of their clandestine rendezvous. Every element had a purpose. Every item was a clue. The hardest part wasn't creating the space, it was the patience. I had to smile through dinners, endure her laugh when her phone lit up with his messages, nod absent-mindedly when she complained about stress at work. And then there was Mark himself. I'd reached out to him a week into my plan, introducing myself as an ambitious architect looking for potential collaborators. "I've heard your name come up a lot," I said in my first email. "Your reputation precedes you." Predictably, he responded with his usual bravado. "I'm always interested in meeting someone who shares my drive," he wrote back. "Let's talk." We met for drinks at an upscale bar downtown. I kept my demeanor warm, professional. He kept his predictable. Over the next hour, he rambled about his success, his cars, his ability to close any deal. The arrogance oozed off him in waves. I smiled and nodded, masking the disgust that churned in my gut. "I've got a project in the works," I told him, swirling the bourbon in my glass. "Something big. I think you'll want in." His eyes lit up at that. Of course they did. A man like Mark was always looking for the next shiny thing to add to his collection. I invited him to dinner at the apartment. "It's nearly complete," I said. "But I need someone with an eye for the finer things to give me feedback. Bring your wife if you'd like. It'll be informal." He grinned, leaning back in his chair. "I'll bring someone better than my wife," he said, with a wink so smug it almost made me laugh out loud. I felt no guilt, no hesitation. The more he revealed himself, the more justified my plan felt. The next day, I casually brought up the dinner to Rachel. "We've got something this weekend," I told her over breakfast, pretending to skim my emails. "A dinner with a potential investor. Mark. You'll like him." Her face didn't betray anything, not even a flicker. She sipped her coffee, nodded, and said, "Sure. Sounds great." I wondered if she'd panicked internally, if she'd immediately texted him after I left the room. Did they laugh about the coincidence? Did they plan their cover story, believing they were too clever for me to see through it? The night of the dinner, I watched Rachel get ready. She wore a black dress that hugged her figure, her makeup flawless, her hair cascading in soft waves. I felt a strange pang, not of love, but of memory. This was the woman I'd fallen for once. This was the woman who'd betrayed me. Mark arrived first, a bottle of expensive wine in hand and a grin plastered across his face. Rachel entered the room moments later, and for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker between them. Surprise? Guilt? Fear? It didn't matter. I ushered them into the apartment with a smile, pouring wine and making small talk as I guided them through the space. They complimented the decor, the layout, the view. Mark laughed too loudly. Rachel's smile was a little too tight. And then, slowly, they started noticing the details. Mark's laughter faded as his eyes lingered on one of the paintings. Rachel's hand trembled slightly as she touched the sculpture. I watched them like a predator watching its prey, savoring every second. This was just the beginning. The air in the apartment felt heavy, electric, as I led Mark and Rachel through the tour. The wine flowed freely, but their sips became smaller, their laughter more strained. The subtle clues embedded in the decor were working, peeling back their confidence layer by layer. Mark paused in front of a black and white photograph hanging on the wall. It showed a blurred figure sitting in what appeared to be a plush armchair, a single champagne flute perched on a glass table nearby. His brow furrowed slightly. "This is interesting," he said, gesturing toward the piece. "Glad you think so," I replied, my voice as smooth as the surface of the wine in my glass. I wanted the space to feel personal, like a reflection of shared moments, memories. "You know how important that is in design, right?" His smile twitched. Rachel hovered nearby, her eyes flitting from the photograph to the sculpture on a nearby table, the one that mimicked the intricate pendant he'd given her. Her fingers lightly brushed her necklace, as if the object in front of her might leap out and expose her secrets. "You've really outdone yourself, Ethan," Rachel said finally, her voice a touch too bright. "This place is beautiful." I gave her a slow nod. "It is, isn't it? Perfect for hosting. Perfect for intimate gatherings." I let the words hang in the air, watching for the crack in her composure. Her smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Mark cleared his throat, motioning toward the grand dining table in the next room. "Shall we sit? I'm starving." We took our seats, and I played the perfect host, serving dinner while carefully steering the conversation. Rachel sat across from me, her posture rigid, her laughter forced. Mark sat beside her, trying to mask his growing discomfort with feigned enthusiasm. As the main course was served, I decided it was time. "You know," I began, swirling the wine in my glass, "this apartment means a lot to me. It's more than a project. It's a symbol of something I've been working toward for months." Rachel raised an eyebrow, her knife stilling mid-cut. "Really? You didn't tell me that." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "Well, it's a surprise. I didn't want to ruin it." Mark chuckled nervously. "A surprise, huh? I love surprises." I fixed my gaze on him, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him squirm. "Oh, I'm sure you do, Mark." The smile froze on his face. Rachel shifted in her chair. I took a slow sip of wine before continuing. "This apartment isn't just a symbol. It's a gift. For you, Rachel." Her eyes widened. "What?" I smiled, keeping my tone measured. "That's right. It's all yours. A place where you can feel free. To be yourself. To share with whomever you like." Mark stiffened, his fork clattering against his plate. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came out. "I wanted this place to reflect you," I said, gesturing around the room. "Every detail. Every piece. Like the sculpture over there." I pointed to the table, where the pendant replica sat, glinting under the chandelier's light. "I thought it captured a certain moment. Wouldn't you agree?" Rachel's face drained of color. Mark's hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "And the photographs," I continued, my voice growing sharper now, like a blade slicing through the pretense. "They remind me of something too. Something familiar." "Mark, do they remind you of anything?" Mark began, but his voice cracked. He reached for his glass of wine, knocking it over in the process. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, what are you doing? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I'm doing what you both should have done months ago. I'm being honest. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of city traffic outside. I know, I said simply, locking eyes with Rachel. About everything. The dinners. The hotels. The late-night messages. Mark. I turned to him now, watching the panic ripple across his face. All of it. Rachel's breath hitched. Ethan, Don't. I cut her off, my voice low and steady. Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation. We're way past that. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado crumbling. Look, Ethan, I think. Shut up, Mark. My voice was sharp enough to slice through his excuses. You don't think. That's the problem. The tension in the room was suffocating now, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like a vice. You see, I said, standing slowly and pacing around the table. This apartment isn't just a gift. It's a statement. A monument to what happens when people think they can get away with lies. With betrayal. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her carefully constructed facade shattering. Ethan, please, we can fix this. I stopped behind her chair, my voice dropping to a near whisper. No, Rachel. We can't. But don't worry. You're not the only one who's going to lose tonight. I turned to Mark, a cold smile tugging at my lips. Isn't that right, Mark? His face turned pale as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the final piece of my plan, the documents that would change everything. The documents felt heavy in my hands as I placed them on the table, right between Rachel and Mark. They were neatly bound, the pages crisp and pristine, ironic, considering the chaos they represented. Mark stared at them, his confusion giving way to unease. Rachel reached for them with trembling fingers, but I stopped her with a quiet, "Don't." I looked at Mark, my tone calm but loaded. You should open them, Mark. After all, they concern you more than anyone. Reluctantly, he slid the papers closer, his hands shaking as he flipped through the first few pages. I watched as the color drained from his face, his mouth falling open slightly. What is this? He stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. It's your financial obituary, I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. A detailed record of every decision you've made over the past few months. Every business deal you thought was a win. Every blind spot you ignored because you were too busy playing the charming adulterer. Mark's eyes darted from the pages to me, his expression a mix of disbelief and panic. You set me up? Not entirely, I said with a shrug. You did most of the work for me. I just nudged things along. Rachel was still frozen, her eyes wide and glassy as she stared at the papers. She clearly didn't understand the implications yet, but Mark did. He knew. Ethan, he started, his voice trembling. You don't know what you've done. You're going to regret this. No, Mark, I interrupted, my voice sharp. You're the one who's going to regret it. I didn't just set you up. I dismantled you. Your investors? Gone. Your assets? Frozen. Your company? Mine. The last word hung in the air like a bomb, detonating between us. Mark flinched as though I'd struck him, the full weight of my words sinking in. You can't just take my company, he shouted, his voice rising in desperation. There are laws. Contracts. I'll fight this. You won't, I said, my tone laced with finality. Because every move I've made is airtight. Every signature, every loophole, every document has been verified. You left the door wide open, Mark, and I walked right in. The only thing you can do now is watch as everything you've built burns to the ground. Rachel's voice cut through the charged silence, small and trembling. Ethan, why? Why would you? I turned to her, and for the first time that night, I let my anger bleed through. Why? I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. You're seriously asking me that? After everything you've done, after every lie, after every night you spent in his bed while I was home, believing in us? She flinched, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. The sound echoed through the room, making them both jump. You didn't just hurt me. You humiliated me. You tore apart the life we built together for what? For him? I gestured toward Mark, who sat there looking like a man on the verge of collapse. Rachel sobbed quietly, her hands covering her face. Mark, meanwhile, seemed to be spiraling, his bravado crumbling with every second. This isn't over, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I'll fix this. It's already over, I interrupted, cutting through his delusions with cold precision. You're done, Mark. Your company is gone, your reputation is ruined, and every person you've stepped on to get to where you are? They're circling like vultures, waiting for their piece of what's left. He slumped back in his chair, his head in his hands. For the first time that night, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. Rachel's sobs grew louder, but I felt nothing for her. No pity. No remorse. Just a cold, hollow satisfaction. You always told me you wanted something more, I said, my voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. Well, Rachel, now you have it. A life with Mark. Enjoy it. I stood, straightening my jacket as I prepared to leave. Where are you going? Rachel choked out, her voice thick with desperation. Forward, I said simply, heading for the door. I paused before stepping out, turning back to look at them one last time. Mark sat in stunned silence, staring blankly at the documents in front of him. Rachel was a wreck, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with every sob. Consider this my parting gift, I said, my voice cold. A lesson in what happens when you build something on lies. Betrayal is the foundation of collapse. Build wisely. And with that, I walked out, leaving them to drown in the ruins of their decisions. The night air was crisp as I stepped onto the street, my mind oddly quiet despite the storm that had just unfolded. I walked toward my car parked a block away, the distant hum of the city muffling the sound of my footsteps. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. As I reached the car, I leaned against the hood for a moment, staring at the city skyline. The apartment tower loomed in the distance, its lights twinkling like stars. Somewhere up there, Mark and Rachel were still inside, grappling with the reality I had delivered. The satisfaction I'd felt during the confrontation had dulled into something else now, something darker. It wasn't regret. No, I didn't regret what I'd done. But the emptiness was undeniable. The kind of emptiness that comes when you've razed everything to the ground and realize there's nothing left to rebuild. I climbed into the car and drove aimlessly for a while, the streets blurring together in the glow of headlights and neon signs. I thought about Rachel, the woman I had once loved more than anything. I thought about how she'd laughed at my jokes, how she'd held my hand during the hard times, how she looked at me on our wedding day like I was the only man in the world. And then I thought about the emails. The late-night messages. The lies. The betrayal had stripped those memories of their warmth, leaving only cold, hollow echoes. Eventually, I found myself parked outside my office. It was past midnight, and the building was dark, except for the faint glow of the security lights. I sat there for a long time, staring at the glass doors and the reflection of my car in their surface. This was where I'd thrown myself into work, where I'd stayed late and convinced myself I was doing it for us. For Rachel. For the future we were supposed to build together. I'd sacrificed so much, only to find out that she'd been tearing it apart behind my back. With a deep breath, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, David Walsh. David was a lawyer, a damn good one. He'd helped me with contracts and real estate deals over the years, and I trusted him more than anyone else in the business. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice groggy but professional. Ethan? What's going on? It's late. I need to meet with you, I said, cutting straight to the point. First thing in the morning? It's about Rachel. There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Does this have anything to do with that private investigator you hired? I shouldn't have been surprised he'd guessed. David knew me too well. It does, I admitted. All right, he said. I'll clear my schedule. Come by the office at 9. I hung up, letting the phone fall into the passenger seat. The next step was clear. Divorce was inevitable, but I wasn't going to let Rachel walk away unscathed. I spent the rest of the night in my office, surrounded by blueprints that now felt meaningless. The designs I had once poured my heart into seemed trivial compared to the wreckage of my personal life. I tried to work, to distract myself, but my thoughts kept circling back to the confrontation. To Rachel's tear-streaked face. To Mark's stunned silence. When morning finally came, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee. I drove to David's office, the city buzzing with its usual morning chaos. David greeted me with a firm handshake and a look of concern. You look like hell, he said, motioning for me to sit. Feel like it too, I muttered, sinking into the chair across from his desk. I laid everything out for him, the affair, the apartment, the documents I'd prepared to dismantle Mark's business. David listened intently, his brow furrowed as he scribbled notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his chest. You've covered your bases well, he said. The financial angle with Mark was smart. Ruthless, but smart. What about Rachel? I asked, my voice tight. What are my options there? David's expression softened slightly. If you're asking whether you can make her pay, the answer is yes. But you need to think carefully about how far you want to take this. I want her out of my life, I said bluntly. No alimony, no settlement, nothing. She made her choices. She can live with them. David nodded, his pen moving swiftly across the page. We'll start with a formal notice. File for divorce and freeze any joint accounts. If she wants to fight, we'll be ready. The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal jargon and paperwork. By the time I walked out of David's office, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The path forward was clear, even if it was a long and bitter road. But as I drove away, a nagging thought crept into my mind. Was this enough? Was cutting Rachel out of my life the closure I needed? Or would the scars of her betrayal linger, no matter how far I moved on? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain: my old life was over. The news of Rachel's betrayal spread faster than I expected. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors spiraled into full-blown stories. It was a cruel irony, really. Rachel had always prided herself on maintaining the perfect image. Now, she was the talk of every social circle we'd ever been part of, her secrets laid bare for everyone to dissect. At first, I thought I'd feel satisfaction. And maybe, for a fleeting moment, I did. But the ripple effect of her actions was deeper and more insidious than I could have imagined. The calls started pouring in, friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances. Everyone wanted to offer their condolences or, worse, their unsolicited opinions. I never liked her, one old friend admitted over the phone. She always seemed off. You're better off without her, Ethan, another said. Man, I can't believe she'd do that to you. After everything you've done for her. I stopped answering after the first few calls. Every word of pity, every half-hearted attempt at support, only reminded me of how thoroughly my life had been upended. Rachel tried reaching out too. The first text came a day after the confrontation at the apartment. Ethan, please. Can we talk? I didn't respond. The second text was longer. I know I messed up, but can't we work this out? We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away. I deleted it without reading the rest. By the third day, her desperation had escalated. She called repeatedly, leaving voicemails filled with tearful apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Ethan, I need you to talk to me. Please. I didn't mean for things to get this far. She didn't understand that we were already past the point of no return. Meanwhile, Mark was unraveling just as spectacularly. His business was in shambles, his accounts frozen, his investors scrambling to cut ties. A mutual acquaintance told me he'd been seen arguing with his lawyer in the lobby of a downtown office building, his face red and his voice loud enough to echo through the halls. I could have stopped there, I suppose. I'd achieved what I set out to do, stripped Mark of his empire and Rachel of her illusions. But part of me wasn't satisfied. I wanted to see the aftermath for myself. It was a week after the dinner when I found myself parked outside Mark's office building, the sleek tower now a symbol of his crumbling empire. I waited until I saw him emerge, his suit wrinkled and his usual arrogance replaced by a weary slump. He didn't see me as I followed him to a nearby cafe. He ordered a coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out his wallet. I watched from a corner table as he sat down, his phone buzzing incessantly. He looked like a man drowning, barely keeping his head above water. And for a moment, a brief, flickering moment, I felt pity. But then I remembered the emails. The smirk on his face when he joked about bringing someone better than his wife to dinner. The way he paraded his affair with Rachel like a trophy, never imagining there'd be consequences. He deserved this. As I walked back to my car, I passed a florist and hesitated. I stepped inside, the scent of roses and lilies overwhelming my senses. I picked out a single white lily, its petals pristine and delicate, and had it wrapped in plain brown paper. I left it on the windshield of Mark's car, a small card tucked beneath the ribbon. The card read, "Consider this a warning, some foundations can't be rebuilt." It was petty, I'll admit. But it felt appropriate. Back at home, the silence was louder than ever. The house felt too big, too empty. Rachel's absence was palpable, her things gone but the memories lingering like ghosts in every corner. I couldn't sit still. I started cleaning compulsively, scrubbing the kitchen counters, rearranging the furniture, throwing out anything that reminded me of her. The trash bags piled up quickly, each one a small victory in my battle to reclaim the space as my own. One night, while rummaging through a box in the attic, I stumbled upon an old photo album. Flipping through its pages, I found pictures of Rachel and me from the early days of our marriage. We looked so happy, so full of hope. I stared at one photo in particular, a candid shot of us laughing during a vacation in the mountains. Rachel's arm was looped through mine, her smile radiant. I barely recognized the woman in the photo. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but the tears didn't come. Instead, I closed the album, put it back in the box, and shoved it to the back of the attic. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, studying my reflection. The man staring back at me looked tired, older than his years, but there was something else in his eyes, something that had been missing for a long time. Clarity. Rachel and Mark had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my talent, my ambition, or my ability to rebuild. And rebuild I would. The days following my decision to rebuild were filled with a strange, quiet determination. The anger and despair that had consumed me in the immediate aftermath of Rachel's betrayal began to fade, replaced by an almost clinical focus. Step 1 was simple: remove the debris. I made lists, dozens of them, mapping out every aspect of my life that needed to change. Bank accounts? Separated. Joint credit cards? Cancelled. Legal proceedings? Already underway. I met with David, my lawyer, almost daily, going over every detail of the divorce, every asset Rachel had tried to claim. Her lawyer will fight for spousal support, David warned me during one meeting, his pen tapping against the edge of his legal pad. Let them try, I said, my voice steady. She signed a prenup. David nodded, his expression approving. Good. That gives us leverage. But don't underestimate how messy this could get. People like Rachel don't go down without a fight. He was right, of course. Rachel had always been resourceful, especially when it came to getting what she wanted. But this time, she was up against someone who knew her better than anyone, someone who had nothing left to lose. Step 2 was harder: rebuild the foundation. The apartment project I had poured so much of myself into had been finished weeks ago, but I couldn't bring myself to hand it off to the client. The space felt tainted, its every detail a reminder of the trap I'd set for Rachel and Mark. So, I started a new project. Something just for me. I rented a small, empty loft in an old industrial building downtown, the kind of space most architects would have dismissed as a lost cause. The walls were cracked, the floors uneven, the windows streaked with grime. But I saw potential. Every evening, I drove to that loft after work and spent hours sketching, measuring, and envisioning. I stripped away the decay piece by piece, watching as the space transformed under my hands. It became a sanctuary, a place where I could create without the weight of my past hanging over me. Step 3 was the most important: reclaim myself. At first, I didn't know where to start. My life had revolved around Rachel for so long that I'd forgotten who I was without her. I tried new things I'd never had time for during our marriage. I joined a boxing gym, the rhythmic thud of fists against the heavy bag becoming an outlet for the frustrations still simmering inside me. I signed up for a cooking class, surprising myself with how much I enjoyed the precision of slicing, dicing, and plating. I even started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd neglected during the years I'd spent trying to make my marriage work. It was awkward at first, explaining why Rachel wasn't around anymore. But the more I opened up, the more I realized how much support I had. "You're handling this better than I would," one friend said over beers one night. "Not sure about that," I replied with a wry smile. "It's been a process. The hardest part was facing the memories. Everywhere I went, there were reminders of Rachel, restaurants we'd loved, streets we'd walked, songs we'd danced to at our wedding. For a while, I avoided those places, skipping over songs on the radio and rerouting my drives to avoid familiar landmarks. But avoidance only went so far. Eventually, I had to confront the memories head-on. One Friday evening, I found myself standing outside the restaurant where Rachel and I had celebrated our first anniversary. It was a small Italian place, nothing fancy, but it had always held a special place in my heart. I almost turned around, the weight of nostalgia pressing down on me like a physical force. But instead, I walked inside. I sat at a corner table, ordered a glass of wine, and watched the couples around me, young, old, laughing, talking, living. The pain was still there, a dull ache that reminded me of what I'd lost. But for the first time, it didn't feel unbearable. It felt manageable. As I walked out of the restaurant that night, I realized something. I wasn't the same man I'd been when Rachel and I had first sat at that table. I wasn't the man who had been blindsided by her betrayal, either. I was someone new. Someone stronger. By the end of the month, the loft was nearly complete. The once crumbling walls were now smooth and painted, the floors polished to a warm sheen. I'd installed a massive drafting table by the windows, where sunlight spilled in every morning, illuminating my sketches. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a symbol of everything I'd reclaimed, my independence, my creativity, my future. One evening, as I stood in the middle of the loft, surveying the finished product, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Rachel. "I know you hate me, but I just want to talk. Please." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. And then, without a second thought, I deleted it. The loft, the plans, the future I was building, it didn't include her anymore. Weeks passed, and with each one, the distance between me and my old life grew. The legal proceedings with Rachel were grinding along as expected, though her resistance surprised even me. She fought over trivial things, furniture, old photo albums, even a set of wine glasses we'd barely used. It wasn't about the items themselves, it was about control. But I refused to let her win. I showed up to every meeting with David prepared, calm, and unrelenting. "She's trying to wear you down," David told me one morning as we sat across from Rachel and her lawyer in the conference room. Rachel avoided my eyes, but I didn't miss the flicker of frustration when I refused to cave. "She's wasting her time," I replied under my breath. David smirked and leaned back in his chair, his confidence radiating. By the end of the meeting, Rachel's lawyer was visibly irritated, and Rachel herself looked exhausted. It was a small victory, but one I carried with me as a reminder that I was winning this war. Despite the progress I was making, there was one part of my past I hadn't faced yet: the people in our shared social circles. Mark had retreated into the shadows, his fall from grace well documented in local business gossip. His name was now synonymous with failure, and he'd quietly sold what little remained of his assets to pay off mounting debts. I heard whispers about him leaving town, though I didn't bother to confirm. But Rachel was still a presence. She had her own way of spinning the narrative, painting herself as the victim of a cold, distant husband. Some people believed her, others didn't. The truth didn't matter as much as the perception, and the perception was muddy at best. I knew it was only a matter of time before I crossed paths with someone from that world, and I was right. It happened on a Saturday morning. I'd gone to a local cafe to grab coffee before heading to the loft when I heard someone call my name. "Ethan?" I turned to see Emily, a mutual friend of ours, standing a few feet away with a to-go cup in hand. She looked hesitant, as if unsure whether to approach. "Emily," I said, offering a small nod. She stepped closer, her brow furrowed. I heard about what happened. With Rachel. I'm so sorry." Her words were genuine, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the same curiosity I'd seen in so many others. People wanted the details, the drama. They wanted to know how much I knew, how much I'd suffered. "Thanks," I said simply, keeping my tone neutral. Emily hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It's just, I can't believe she did that to you. Everyone's been talking about it, but I didn't want to believe it until—" She stopped herself, realizing she'd said too much. I smiled faintly, cutting her off before she could dig herself any deeper. "Don't worry about it, Emily. It's in the past now." But it wasn't in the past, not entirely. That evening I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, something I hadn't done in months. I hadn't planned to, but the encounter with Emily had stirred something in me, a need to revisit the moments before everything fell apart. There we were at our wedding, Rachel's smile so wide it looked like it might crack her face. A photo of us on our honeymoon, standing on a windswept cliff overlooking the ocean. Another from a Christmas party, her arm looped through mine as we laughed at some joke I couldn't remember. The memories felt like ghosts, haunting me with their warmth. I should have felt anger, bitterness, even hate. But what I felt instead was sadness, not for her, but for the life we'd shared. A life I had loved, even if she hadn't. The next day, I drove to the park where Rachel and I had spent so many lazy afternoons, sitting under the shade of the old oak tree near the pond. I hadn't been back there since the affair, and as I parked the car, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. The park was as I remembered it, quiet, peaceful, full of families and couples enjoying the crisp autumn air. The oak tree still stood by the pond, its leaves golden and brilliant in the late afternoon light. I walked toward it, my footsteps slow and deliberate. As I stood beneath its branches, I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me: Rachel's laughter, the feel of her hand in mine, the warmth of the sun on our faces. But when I opened my eyes, the spell was broken. The tree was just a tree. The pond was just a pond. And Rachel was just a woman, a flawed, selfish woman who had chosen someone else over me. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, painting the water with streaks of orange and gold. And then, finally, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. When I got to the loft that evening, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space filled with the warm, soft light of the setting sun. I stood in the middle of the room, looking at the life I was creating for myself, one not tied to Rachel, or Mark, or anyone else. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The first hint of closure came on a Wednesday afternoon, as I sat in David's office reviewing the final divorce paperwork. The stack of papers between us felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of the past 7 years was somehow condensed into those pages. David tapped the top of the stack with his pen. "This is it, Ethan. Once you sign, it's official. No more negotiations." No more meetings. Rachel's out of your life. I stared at the papers, the words blurring slightly as my mind wandered. Was this really the end? The finish line of this painful, winding journey? For a brief moment, I felt a pang of hesitation, not because I wanted to hold on to Rachel, but because signing those papers felt like admitting defeat. But it wasn't defeat, was it? It was survival. It was reclaiming my life. With a deep breath, I picked up the pen and scrawled my name across the dotted line. David slid the papers into a folder, his expression a mix of relief and approval. You did the right thing, he said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The finality of it hit me as I walked out of his office and into the bright afternoon sunlight. The marriage was over. The chapter was closed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. That night, I returned to the loft, pouring myself a glass of wine as I stood by the massive windows overlooking the city. The skyline glittered in the distance, a reminder that life moved on, no matter how much it felt like it had stopped during those dark days. I'd been rebuilding for weeks now, my career, my confidence, my sense of self. But something was still missing. A final act. A way to cement the closure I so desperately needed. That opportunity came unexpectedly. I received an email from Rachel 2 days later. It was short, barely a paragraph, but it carried the weight of someone trying to reach across a chasm they knew they'd created. Ethan, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I needed to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope one day you can find peace. Rachel. I read the email 3 times, the words bouncing around my mind like stray echoes. It was the apology I'd wanted months ago, the acknowledgement of her betrayal. But now it felt hollow. Too little, too late. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted it, watching the screen blink back to its empty state. Later that evening, I drove to the apartment I'd designed, the one where I'd orchestrated the dinner that exposed Rachel and Mark. It had been sitting empty since that night, its luxurious interiors now cold and unused. I walked through the space, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The paintings were still on the walls, the sculptures still in place, each one a reminder of the plan I'd executed so perfectly. But now, the apartment felt like a relic of a past I no longer wanted to carry with me. I made a decision right then and there. The apartment wasn't a monument to betrayal anymore. It was a blank slate. Within days, I put it on the market. The listing garnered attention almost immediately. Its stunning design and prime location made it irresistible. By the end of the month, it was sold to a young couple starting their life together. It felt poetic in a way. The space that had been a battleground for my pain was now a place where someone else could find joy. As I handed over the keys to the new owners, the husband shook my hand. This is a masterpiece, he said, beaming. We're so grateful. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little more. Take care of it, I replied. And each other. The loft became my new haven after that. I spent my days designing, creating, pouring my energy into projects that reignited my passion for architecture. The nights were quieter now, filled with books, music, and the occasional visit from friends who reminded me that life was still full of possibility. One evening, as I stood on the loft's balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had fueled me, that had driven every decision since the betrayal, was gone. I still didn't forgive Rachel. That wasn't something I owed her. But I forgave myself, my naivety, my blind trust, my willingness to believe in a love that hadn't been real for far too long. The scars were still there, faint but visible. They always would be. But they didn't define me anymore. I was moving forward, one step at a time. The finality of the journey hit me one morning as I stood in the loft, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. It was quiet except for the faint hum of the city below, a comforting reminder of life's ceaseless rhythm. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't weighed down by thoughts of Rachel or Mark. Their ghosts no longer haunted me. The sale of the apartment had closed the last physical connection I had to that chapter of my life. My lawyer, David, had confirmed that the divorce was officially finalized. No more emails from Rachel, no more calls. Just a clean break, like the snapping of a taut string. The loft was nearly unrecognizable from the empty shell I'd first walked into months ago. It had transformed into something that felt uniquely mine, a reflection of the man I had become, a man rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. The walls were adorned with my own artwork, sketches and concepts that had emerged from late nights spent finding myself again. The space exuded warmth and strength, a far cry from the sterile emptiness I had once felt. I started running in the mornings, something I hadn't done since college. It wasn't about fitness as much as it was about clearing my mind, feeling the pavement under my feet, and reconnecting with my body. There was something liberating about pushing myself, about reclaiming control over the things I could. One crisp morning, during one of those runs, I stopped at a small park bench overlooking the river. A woman was sitting there, sketching something in a notebook. She had a calm presence about her, her auburn hair catching the light as she worked. I didn't mean to stare, but something about her focus struck me. She glanced up and caught me looking. Instead of annoyance, she smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her hazel eyes. "Morning," she said, her voice as easy as the breeze around us. "Morning," I replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious. She gestured to the empty side of the bench. "You can sit if you want. It's a good spot for thinking." I hesitated for a moment, then sat down. "Do you come here often?" I asked, a cliché that made us both laugh. "Every week," she said, closing her notebook. "It helps me work through ideas. I'm a graphic designer." "An artist," I said with a nod. "And you?" she asked, her eyes curious but not probing. "I'm an architect." The words felt different this time, lighter somehow. She smiled again, and we talked for a while about nothing and everything. Her name was Claire, and she had an easy, grounded energy that I hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people sharing a quiet moment in the middle of a bustling world. When I got back to the loft that morning, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't holding my breath anymore, waiting for the next wave of pain or anger to crash over me. Instead, I felt present. Days turned into weeks, and my life began to settle into a rhythm. Work picked up as word spread about the loft's transformation. New clients came knocking, intrigued by the designs I'd poured my heart into. One evening, as I stood at my drafting table, working on a concept for a modern community center, I thought about Rachel. Not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Her betrayal had destroyed the life I thought I wanted, but it had also forced me to confront truths I'd been ignoring for years. The man I was now, stronger, more focused, and unafraid to stand alone, wouldn't have existed without the pain she'd caused. It was Claire who helped me understand that fully. We started meeting at the park more often, sharing coffee and ideas. She told me about her own struggles, her own heartbreaks, and I told her mine. There was no rush to define what we were. We were simply two people finding solace in each other's company. One day, as we sat by the river, she looked at me and said, "You're different than most people I've met." "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You're not afraid of starting over," she said simply. "Most people cling to what's broken because they're too scared to let go. But you let it go." Her words stayed with me long after that day. She was right. I'd let it go. The anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, it was all behind me now. Months later, I stood in the loft again, looking out at the city skyline. The space was complete now, every corner a testament to the journey I'd taken. Claire was there too, sitting on the couch with her sketchpad, her presence a quiet reminder that life could surprise you in the best ways when you least expected it. The pain Rachel and Mark had caused me was real, but it didn't define me anymore. I had built something new, something stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in warm, golden light, I realized this was the beginning of something beautiful. Not because of Claire, or the loft, or the work I'd done, but because I'd found myself again. And this time, I wasn't afraid of falling.